Hey guys, what's up? Nate here from Protoculture. Welcome back to Sonic Academy. Another video today, and we're going to be looking at ways to process kick drums. Now, Sonic Academy has an amazing tool called Kick 2 for synthesizing kick drums, but I'm finding myself more and more these days when it comes down to actually writing, I'm using samples more than anything else. Kick 2 is great when I'm doing a bit of sound design work and actually creating those things, but I'm going to be looking at ways that you can process your kicks to mold them a little bit better in your mix, to make them more punchy and sit better in the mix. So let's dive right in, and we're going to take a look at a few tips on how to mix and process your kick drums. Let's check it out. Right, so I've got a little bass line loaded in from Anna, just a simple saw wave, and I've got a kick drum loaded into the Cubase sampler. It sounds like this. Right, first things first, one tip that works so much for me, and I see this problem a lot when I get clients sending me stuff to mix or master. It's not so much a process, but a tool that I'm going to use inside of the sampler track. You can hear everything is a little bit muddied up here. There's just too much going on in the bottom end as well. So one thing that you want to do is, depending on the style of music that you're working in, there are occasions where you're going to want longer kick drums like this, but the first thing I do is to actually reduce the length of the kick drum. When you're working with 4/4 stuff like this, you really want to kind of make space for that bass, and the most important part of the kick is really the attack phase, and you can still get that feeling of heavy bass just from that initial attack. So what I do is, in the sampler track, I turn on the amp mod in Cubase, and you should be able to do this with any sampler inside of Ableton or whatever DAW you have on hand. Cubase has got a pretty handy little function to set the sync on, and you'll see now that you actually have things set by 16th notes here. So you can apply an amp envelope to a kick to kind of shape it. It has a similar effect to sort of compression as well, and gating almost. But what we're going to do is we're going to drive this back to about 1/16th note, which is kind of where the real body of the kick is. And then everything after that, we're going to start fading down. And in this case, I've got a side chain applied to my bass line here. You can see we want to kind of have the kick in this area here and then have it fade out there. We don't want these two competing for space in the mix. So just take a listen to the difference now when I have this dialed back. Everything automatically has just got more space to breathe. It's a lot more punchy, but you still haven't lost the weight of that kick as well. So short kicks, it's going to solve so many of your problems, especially because the bass takes up so much room of so much of your headroom as well. So you really want to make sure that those are not competing for space. So a simple volume envelope like this. You can also do something like that to basically increase the attack of the kick as well. We'll have a louder attack. We'll lower the sub a little bit later on as well, just to kind of make the kick slightly more punchy as well. But yeah, really, really important that, especially with this kind of 4/4 music where you've got a bass line taking up the rest of those 3/16th notes, shorten your kicks. It'll solve a lot of issues for you when it comes down to the mix. Right, so the next thing I want to look at is EQ. We're going to jump into our kick channel here, and let's load up a EQ. So one thing I typically do quite often is, it sounds sort of counterintuitive, but quite often less bass is more bass. The bass that you really want is the kind of quite present stuff in a lot of cases. Like I said again, sometimes you do want those big heavy subs, but I tend to roll off a bit of my bass down at the bottom here. So around 35 hertz or whatever, I'll often get rid of that just to kind of free up headroom again. Remember, all those low frequencies, the lower they go, the more space they take up in your mix. So I'll often get rid of a little bit of that. And then there's a couple of sort of magic frequencies that I often find I go to when I'm EQing kick drums as well. One of them is this frequency around about here, so like around 160 hertz. It can vary depending on what you're doing at any given time. But just take a listen to how this kind of almost shifts the kick underneath the bass line when you pull out this frequency. Let's take a listen to that frequency first, actually. of distortion happening there now. But you can hear it's quite an uncomfortable frequency almost. And when you pull that out sometimes, not every kick is going to have this issue. But you can hear how it's kind of dropped down underneath the bass line. I really like that kind of sound in a kick drum. Take a listen to the difference when we bypass this. Really kind of accentuates that sub, and then it's leaving the attack and the higher frequency stuff intact up at the top. Sometimes as well, the 300 mark here can be a little bit muddy. I often find with kick drums it doesn't bother me so much. That's more like a frequency that I look at for bass or in a master as well. Sometimes you can get a nice bit of punch around this 250 mark there. Also around 90 to 100, sometimes there's a nice bit of punch as well. Also, because I've shortened this kick, you can quite easily go and boost those subs a little bit more, get away with it because you haven't got a bass playing at that specific period of time. And even with a kick short like that, we can still get it sounding nice and boomy just by adding a little bit of EQ in there. Another spot that I like to look at is if I'm trying to get a slightly more sort of punchy attack or a click that really pops through, is to come up here to around 8K or even up to 10. And if your kick has got a nice click to it, it can be quite nice to just pull out that kick. Just do be careful with your gain staging that you're not driving the EQ too far when you're doing boosts like this, so you don't have that distorting when it leaves the EQ. Then kind of depending on how punchy you want this, you can either get some out of the middle to make room for vocals if you're wanting a slightly softer sounding kick. If you're wanting something a little bit harsher, you can boost a little bit in the mid-range as well. It'll be a little bit more in your face when you do something like that. So that's a bit of EQ that I do quite often. That 161 is important for me. I find myself using that range of frequencies so often when I'm processing kick drums like this. Right, so let's take a look at compression. Compression can be a great way to tighten up the kick drum as well, especially if you're trying to get that sort of nice, really in-your-face punch from the attack on the kick. There are some problems with using compression on kick drums, though, because of the amount of low-frequency content in there. The low-frequency content is always going to be higher in volume or in amplitude than your high-frequency content. So what happens when you push that through a compressor, we'll use something like, let's just grab an SSL compressor as well. It's probably not the ideal compressor for a kick, but I just want to illustrate a point here. When you have a threshold that's basically looking at all the frequencies at once, the problem that you have when you start dialing this down, you can hear how the bottom end of the kick kind of disappears, but that's because the bottom end is hitting the threshold before anything else. It's pulling that down, and then all you're left with at the end is the high frequency content. So if you're going to use a compressor like this, the way to get around that is to actually sidechain internally to actually allow the low frequencies through with the compressor. And you can hear the subs are kind of coming back in there, and we're still compressing quite harshly. In this case, though, we're still losing quite a bit of that punch. So the way that I like to do compression is either with something like Pro Audio DSP's Dynamic Spectrum Mapper, because that one can actually do a curved threshold, or to do it with a multiband compressor. We'll grab Neutron 3, for example. Whereby we can actually split into two compressors and do what we want to do with the punchy part of the kick, and then not compress the subs too much. So what we'll do is we'll add a split down here, around there somewhere. Dial in a slight amount of compression, nothing too hectic for the subs, just to kind of bring the attack down a little bit for that. And then we can leave more tack to create more punch in the top section, but we can compress this much harder now because there are two compressors that are split doing the work. So you can really hear that punch kicking through there now. Bring that down slightly. Going through a little bit more tack there, maybe a faster release on this one. And we can actually use this as kind of like an EQ to boost the lows as well a little bit. So that's one way to look at compressing the kick to get more punch. Another thing I like to do, which is kind of similar to compression, technically not a compressor, but a dynamics processor nonetheless, is to use a transient shaper. Once again, though, I'm going to use a multi-band one. I don't want to be shaping the transients too much for the low frequency stuff at all. So to get that punch, we can once again split there and use a transient shaper to boost the top part of the kick slightly. That's quite extreme examples, but you can hear how much more punch you've got there. When you're using a transient shaper, though, you may want to actually use a limiter after it as well, just to kind of catch those peaks. A good way to do that would just be to use the Neutron 3 channel strip. It's got a built-in limiter on it. So let's go and add in our transient shaper. We'll add some attack to the top part. We'll leave that one down there. And then just engage the limiter as well. Let's take a listen. Lots more attack going on there now in that higher frequency arrangement, nice and punchy kick drum. Especially if you're working with stuff like 808s, which are typically quite dark sounding kicks, you can really kind of get them to thwack a little bit harder using something like this. So speaking of getting stuff to be more upfront and in your face, another great way to do that is to add some extra harmonics into your kick drum, especially if you, again, if especially you're working with a clean kick drum. The same goes for when you're working with like a sub bass, for example, and it's a sine wave. A sine wave itself tends to get lost in the mix. And again, like I said, less bass sometimes is kind of more bass. If you want that sort of upfront stuff, you need higher frequency content in that bass. And a good way to do that is to add in some extra harmonics onto your kick. One plugin I love for that is, especially on kick drums, it's not quite as obvious as some of the other saturation plugins I have, but that's this one from SPL. So we can add a little bit of saturation. So not to the point that you're distorting it completely, you want to dial that back. But I like to push the upper harmonics or the uneven harmonics slightly more. Let's take a listen to the difference. So it's quite subtle, but you can hear it's just a little bit more in your face now, and it just cuts through the mix a little bit more. It just changes the sort of tonality of the kick to something slightly more brittle. And yeah, adding those extra harmonics will make a big difference as to how sort of upfront that kick is going to be. Another great one that I use is Inflator, which is also, it doesn't tend to distort too much, but it still gets things sounding a lot more upfront in your face. Take a listen to the difference that we have here with this one, for example. So that's another great way to kind of get your kicks to kind of push out of your mix and be a little bit more upfront. Right, so the last one I'm going to look at is, again, not specifically a plugin for processing, but a means of just shaping your kick a little bit more, and that's layering kicks, specifically with one tool for me that I really like. We can come in here to our sampler and in Cubase, I can transfer this to a new instrument, and we'll transfer this to Backbone. Once I've got that opened up here, I can just add my kicks onto that Backbone channel. We may need to just transfer our plugins and EQ that we have. There we go. And let's take a look at what we can do with Backbone. So when it comes to layering, I mean, you could do stuff like layer other kicks into this. But I want to look at a process of actually splitting kicks apart at a spectral level and then tweaking them from there to make sure that your kick sits with the bass correctly. You can pretty much tune kick drums this way as well. It's a great way to kind of make audio kicks without synthesizing them, to try and make your audio sit better with the track as far as keys and stuff go. I typically don't worry too much about tuning, but this can really help make the kicks sit in the track without changing too much of the EQ and so forth. The way you do that with Backbone is we'll select our kick sample here. You can hit this pre-listen button and you'll see it will actually split the tonal elements and the noise elements into separate files for you. You can adjust the cutoff and the sensitivity. We'll leave it just like that for now. Once you're happy with your settings here, you can just click apply and you'll see you now have two separate layers. So you can adjust the tuning of the kick without actually affecting the noise element or the initial sort of upper frequency attack part of the kick. Because quite often, if you are going to transpose your kick, take a listen carefully to the sort of top end of this kick. You can really hear how the attack gets dulled when I pull that an octave down. The benefit of Backbone in this case is we can shift this element of the kick without affecting that element of the kick. So let's pull this down a little bit. We'll try and transpose the sub element. So you can get a really nice low down kick, but it hasn't actually affected that punch or the attack phase at all. And we can take this a step further now as well. If we jump into the pitch section, we can actually apply pitch shifting and change the whole sort of character of the kick completely. We'll add in a bit of envelope. So now we get this really, really low kick drum there, but we've also sort of got a little bit of that more punchy attack in the subsection as well by using the pitch envelope. See the difference? And we'll bring our attack back in. So that's a really, really handy tool for processing kicks further from audio and then really kind of shaping them into something new that suits your track better. You can technically do this with some filters and just layering the kicks. It's not quite as easy to get right because essentially you've got to filter out a section which still has some of the tonality in it. You can get a bit of phasing and things occurring sometimes like that. This sort of method of spectrally pulling them apart works the best. You could use something like RX or spectral layers as well to do something like this, but Backbone really was designed to make that sort of task very easy, and it's a great piece of software for working with percussion and especially kick drums. So there you have it. That's a couple of ways that I work a lot with my kicks and processing ideas that I do quite often in my own tracks. I hope you guys enjoyed this video, and I'll catch you soon here at Sonic Academy. Cheers.
Thanks everyone for watching. We really appreciate all the support from you guys. If you love this video, then smash a like, and if you want to be notified about new videos, hit the subscribe and notification buttons. Peace!